The corridor of St. Mercy Private Hospital was the territory of doctors who'd graduated from Harvard and Johns Hopkins, a place where their egos were larger than the million-dollar diplomas hanging on the walls. When Audrey Cole walked in with dark circles under her eyes from working 3 consecutive shifts, and scrubs wrinkled like they'd been pulled from a bin of old clothes, they didn't just ignore her. They whispered. They pointed. They laughed. They called her a murderer. They called her a white coat killer. They called her a walking corpse the hospital pitied enough to keep employed. They wanted her gone. They wanted her to lower her head in shame and walk out through those glass doors, never to return. But they didn't know who she really was. They didn't know that 6 months earlier, she'd been framed for a patient's death, a crime she hadn't committed. They didn't know that her trembling hands weren't from alcoholism or lack of sleep. They were the residue of 4 years stitching wounds under gunfire in Kandahar. They didn't know that the faint scars on her wrists weren't from weakness. They were shrapnel marks from an ambush she'd been the only one to survive. They didn't know she'd once been a battlefield nurse. They didn't know she'd saved 127 lives in conditions that those polished, high-status doctors would have done nothing but shake and cry in. And they certainly didn't know that the VIP patient being flown in by helicopter tonight, the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago, the man the entire city feared, would live or die depending on the very nurse they despised. Because when their famous doctor stood trembling over a pool of blood, unable to tell where the fatal wound was, only one person in that room would know what to do, and it wouldn't be the doctor. It would be Audrey Cole, the murderer, the white coat killer, the nurse they wanted thrown out onto the street. Tonight, she'd prove them wrong, or she'd truly become the killer they'd always called her. If you want to know what happens next, hit like right now. Share this video with anyone who needs the reminder. Never underestimate anyone, and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this story is only just beginning. The nurses' break room sat at the far end of the 3rd-floor corridor, where fluorescent light fell on exhausted faces and cups of coffee gone cold. But tonight, that room wasn't quiet at all. Laughter rang out, sharp as shattered glass, cutting through the thin door and plunging straight into Audrey Cole's chest as she stood outside with a medication tray in her hands, her feet unable to move forward. She heard her name. She heard the word murderer repeated again and again like a familiar refrain they never tired of singing. Vanessa Hall, the woman who had used the vacancy left by Audrey at their old hospital to secure a high-level recommendation, had recently transferred to St. Mercy to oversee the new surgical wing, bringing her poisonous ambition with her as she told the whole room about the little killer nurse in a tone that sounded like a ghost story for children. Brandon Price, a second-year resident with a wide grin and an ego bigger than his medical degree, burst into laughter and said he couldn't understand why the hospital kept a dead weight like that, probably because nobody would take night shifts except failures. Audrey drew a slow, deep breath. She counted to 10 in her head. Then she pushed the door and walked in. The laughter died as if someone had yanked the plug from the wall. Every set of eyes turned toward her, some curious, some contemptuous, but not one held compassion. Audrey didn't look at anyone. She went straight to her locker, unlocked it, and reached for her coat to get ready for the next shift. But before her fingers could touch the handle, something flew straight into her face. A white lab coat, except it wasn't white anymore. It was smeared with dried blood, yellowed fluid, and the stench of things Audrey didn't want to name. She peeled it off her face and looked down. Her hand trembled slightly. Brandon Price stood a few steps away, arms folded across his chest, a triumphant smile spreading on his mouth. "Hey, new nurse," he said, his voice thick with mockery. "The toilet in room 402 is clogged. The patient threw up everywhere. Go clean it." Audrey looked at him. She wanted to say she was a nurse, not a janitor. She wanted to say she had saved lives in conditions he couldn't even imagine. She wanted to say these hands had stitched wounds while bombs detonated less than 10 meters away, had pressed on a heart when blood sprayed like a broken pipe, had kept boys younger than him alive long enough to speak their mothers' names one last time. But she didn't say anything. She just bent down, picked up the filthy coat, and walked out of the room. The laughter rose again behind her, louder, longer, as if they'd won a battle she didn't even bother to fight. Audrey walked down the corridor past silent patient rooms, past flickering lights, until she found a shadowed corner near the fire stairs. She leaned her back against the wall and took out her phone. On the screen was the photo she'd looked at hundreds of times over the past 6 months. Penny, her little sister, 22 years old, with a radiant smile and eyes exactly like their mother's. In the picture, Penny lay in a hospital bed, skin pale, her hand threaded with IV lines, yet still lifting 2 fingers in a peace sign. Audrey remembered the last time she'd visited, 2 weeks ago. Penny had held her hand and said, her voice weak but still trying to joke, "Don't worry, I'll be fine. You just need to worry about you." But Audrey knew the truth. She knew lupus was chewing through her sister's body day by day. She knew the hospital bills were $15,000 a month, and that number was climbing. She knew she owed $47,000, and if she lost this job, she'd have nothing left. Penny would have nothing left. That was why she swallowed the humiliation. That was why she stayed silent when they called her a murderer. That was why she was standing here, holding someone else's filthy coat, about to scrub a toilet like a servant. For Penny, only for Penny, Audrey wiped away her tears, slid the phone into her pocket, and started toward room 402. As she passed the nurse's station, a soft voice called out, "Audrey." She turned. Maggie Chen, a veteran nurse with silver hair and kind eyes, stood there. She didn't say anything else. She only nodded to Audrey, a small gesture in an ocean of hostility. Audrey nodded back, and for a brief moment, she felt like she was still human. 6 months ago, Audrey Cole wasn't a murderer. 6 months ago, she was the most loved nurse in the emergency intensive care unit at Memorial General Hospital, the one doctors trusted with the hardest cases, the one patients always wanted to hold hands with during long, painful nights. 6 months ago, she still believed that if she worked hard and stayed devoted, justice would stand on her side. She was wrong. That fateful night began like any other. Except Audrey's shift stretched into 16 straight hours, because 2 other nurses called out sick at the last minute. She'd had 4 cups of coffee. She'd run herself sore up and down the halls past dozens of rooms. She'd changed dressings, given injections, soothed panicked patients and desperate families. And when the clock struck 3 in the morning, she received a new admission. Harold Henderson, 78 years old, admitted for congestive heart failure. He was a gentle man with pale blue eyes and a tired smile. When Audrey checked his vital signs for the first time, he took her hand and said, "You're so young and you look this exhausted. Go home and sleep, girl." Audrey smiled and told him she'd sleep when he was doing better. She didn't know it would be their last conversation. At 4:45 in the morning, the monitor screamed its alarm. Audrey was in the next room, less than 10 steps away. She ran in and saw Mr. Henderson convulsing. His eyes rolled back. His heart stopped. She started CPR immediately, compressing his chest in steady rhythm, counting in her head, calling for help over the intercom. The code team arrived within 2 minutes. They shocked him, pushed epinephrine, did everything by the book. But Mr. Henderson didn't come back. After 23 minutes of resuscitation, the attending physician pronounced him dead. Audrey stood there, her hands still shaking, her scrubs soaked with sweat, staring at the white sheet drawn over the gentle man she'd spoken to only hours earlier. She'd done everything right. She knew she had, but no one cared. Mr. Henderson's family arrived the next morning, and they needed someone to blame. His son, a lawyer in an expensive suit with eyes as cold as money, screamed in Audrey's face right there in the hallway. He said she'd neglected his father. He said she hadn't checked often enough. He said she was a murderer, and then he sued the hospital. The investigation began. Audrey was certain she'd be cleared, because she'd signed the patient monitoring forms on time, exactly as required, not a single line missing. But when the disciplinary board opened the file, her signatures weren't there anymore. Someone had erased them. Someone had turned her from a devoted nurse into a negligent one who abandoned a patient. Audrey cried. She begged them to check the cameras, check the witnesses, check anything at all. But the hallway camera that night was broken, and none of her coworkers stepped forward to testify. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to risk their career for a night shift nurse they weren't close to. Vanessa Hall, the woman Audrey had once thought of as a friend, was the first to turn away. She stood before the board and said Audrey was forgetful, frequently exhausted, and had problems with focus. Every word out of Vanessa's mouth felt like a knife in Audrey's back, and Audrey never knew why. The result was that Audrey was fired. Her nursing license was suspended for 6 months pending further investigation. Her name was tied to Mr. Henderson's death like a stain that wouldn't wash out. She remembered the night she called Penny to tell her. Her little sister was lying in a hospital bed, her body worn down by lupus. Yet she still tried to sit up when she heard Audrey's voice break. "What happened, sis?" Penny asked, her voice tight with worry. And Audrey told her. She told her everything, from beginning to end, while tears wouldn't stop falling. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Audrey heard sobbing. Penny was crying. Her little sister, who was fighting a deadly illness every day, was crying for her. "I believe you," Penny said through her sobs. "I'll always believe you. You're the best person I know." Audrey held the phone and cried with her all through that night. And she swore to herself that no matter what happened, she wouldn't give up. For Penny. 6 months later, Audrey stood at St. Mercy with her license newly reinstated, with a new job that felt like it could vanish at any moment, with the nickname Murderer clinging to her like a shadow. And she was still fighting. One day at a time, 1 hour at a time. The clock on the wall read 11:45 at night when Audrey heard that sound. At first, it was only a distant hum, like a mosquito whining in the stillness. But then it grew. It drew closer, and it became a roar that tore open the hospital's quiet air. Audrey froze in the middle of the corridor, still holding the medication tray, her eyes lifting to the ceiling as if she could see through concrete and find the night sky outside. She knew that sound. She knew it better than anyone in this building. It wasn't the steady, gentle rhythm of a typical medevac helicopter. It was the sound of a steel beast, the kind of heavy military aircraft she'd heard hundreds of times in Kandahar, the kind they used only when they needed to move someone important or someone who was about to die. And sometimes, both. Memory hit her like a tidal wave. The smell of hot sand, the stink of gunpowder, the metallic tang of dried blood under a punishing sun, the screams of her unit, the prayers of young men slipping away. Audrey gripped the tray so hard her knuckles went white. She tried to breathe deep, to haul herself back into the present, back into the cold corridor of St. Mercy, back into the life she was living now. Then, the overhead paging system exploded into the silence. Code black. Trauma Bay 1. High-value patient incoming. All senior staff report immediately. Audrey frowned. Code black. High-value patient. That wasn't civilian hospital language. That was military language. The language of classified operations, of lives priced in money and power. She set the tray down on the nearest counter and started running toward the main entrance. Not because she'd been called. She knew all too well she wasn't allowed anywhere near any important patient. But the soldier's instinct in her couldn't sit still when she heard the battlefield calling. The emergency lobby turned into a war zone. The front doors burst open, and a rush of cold air swept in with a wave of men. First came the ones in black suits, built like boulders, their eyes scanning every corner with the alertness of people who lived with danger. Then came the gurney, and on it lay a man motionless in a sea of blood. Audrey pressed herself behind a pillar and watched. She saw blood, so much blood, soaking through the white sheet, dripping to the floor, leaving a long trail like the footprint of death. She counted at least 3 bullet wounds, one in the left chest, one in the abdomen, and one somewhere near the neck she couldn't see clearly. The man on the gurney had black hair and a sharply cut face, and even unconscious and paper pale from blood loss, he radiated a frightening authority. Dr. Richard Mercer, the head of emergency, rushed out in a spotless white coat with his usual confident smile. But that smile died the second he saw the entourage and the amount of blood on the floor. "This is a hospital," Mercer started, his voice still trying to hold on to command. "You can't storm in here like this and—" He didn't get to finish. One of the men in suits, the biggest one with a thick jawline beard and a long scar running down his neck, stepped forward and grabbed Mercer by the collar. He lifted the doctor off the ground like a doll and growled into his face, his voice low as thunder. "Listen, doctor. The man on that gurney is Rhett Blackwood. You keep him alive, or this hospital won't exist by tomorrow morning. Do you understand?" Audrey pulled in a sharp breath. Rhett Blackwood. You didn't live in Chicago without knowing that name. The boss of the Blackwood Empire, the man people said ruled half the city from the shadows, the man even the police had to think twice about touching, and now he was lying there, in a pool of his own blood, less than 10 meters from her. Mercer was dropped back to the floor, his face drained white, his hands shaking as he tried to pull himself together. Get him into Trauma Bay 1, Mercer stammered, his confidence gone. "Call everyone, prep the OR." The group moved like a whirlwind, dragging Mercer with them and vanishing behind the double doors of the trauma wing. Audrey stayed where she was, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. She knew she shouldn't be here. She knew she'd be in trouble if anyone saw her. But something pulled her toward that door. Something told her tonight would be different. Tonight, everything would change. Audrey moved like a ghost along the corridor, avoiding the lights and the curious looks, until she stopped in front of the thick glass of Trauma Bay 1. Inside, the room looked like a miniature battlefield. Blood smeared across the floor, monitors shrieking, and dozens of hands trying to hold on to a life that was slipping away from Rhett Blackwood. Doctor. Mercer stood in the dominant position, but even through the glass, Audrey could see his hands shaking. He was trained as a cosmetic surgeon, not a true trauma doctor. He was good at tightening skin and suctioning fat, not at facing 3 bullet wounds and a patient bleeding to death. "Where's the injury?" Mercer shouted, his voice sharp and frantic. "I can't find the primary source of bleeding. Blood is everywhere." Vanessa Hall stood beside him, holding blood-soaked gauze, her face gone pale. Brandon Price was trying to run fluids, but his hands shook so badly the needle slipped out twice in a row. The whole team was collapsing, and Audrey could see it as clearly as daylight. Her gaze swept over the patient's body, and the battlefield nurse in her snapped awake. The chest wound was being compressed. The abdominal wound was being monitored, but something was wrong. Audrey looked closer, and she saw it. A small wound on the left side of the neck, almost hidden by blood and shadow. Not the main bullet wound, but an injury from a fragment, shrapnel thrown off course, and it was cutting into the carotid artery. That was why the bleeding wouldn't stop no matter how hard they pressed on the larger wounds. That was why the blood pressure kept dropping no matter how much fluid they poured in. The man was bleeding to death from a wound no one could see. "No," Audrey whispered, her hand against the ice-cold glass. "Look at his neck. Look at his neck." But no one heard her, and then the sound she feared most filled the room. The monitor shifted from a steady beep to a flat line and a long, monotonous tone. Flatline. Rhett Blackwood's heart stopped. Code blue," Mercer screamed. "Start CPR. Get the defibrillator ready." Audrey watched through the glass as they began compressions. Watched them prepare the paddles, and she knew it would be useless. Chest compressions would only pump blood out faster through the carotid injury. A shock wouldn't do anything if there wasn't enough blood left in the body for a heart to move. They were saving him the wrong way, and that man would be dead in 60 seconds. Audrey didn't think. She didn't weigh consequences, didn't think about the career already shattered, didn't think about being fired or even arrested. She just shoved the door open and charged in. "Stop CPR," Audrey shouted, her voice cracking through the room like thunder. "You're killing him." Everyone froze. Mercer spun around, his eyes wide when he saw Audrey. "What are you doing in here?" "Security. Get her out." But Audrey didn't stop. She forced her way through the crowd, shoved Vanessa aside, and took her place at the table. Her eyes locked on the wound at Rhett Blackwood's neck, and her hands moved on instinct. She had no gloves, no instruments, only bare hands and 4 years of experience in hell. Audrey plunged her hand into the wound, felt the warm blood jetting through her fingers, and pressed hard. She found the torn artery, and she sealed the tear with her fingertip, pinning it against the vessel wall. This wasn't in any medical textbook. This was battlefield medicine, the kind you used when you had nothing but your hands and the will to keep someone alive. "Clamp!" Audrey barked, her voice no longer the voice of a nurse they bullied. It was an officer's voice, the voice that gave orders under fire. "Size 2. Now." No one moved. Mercer stood there like a statue, his mouth open. Vanessa trembled, her eyes full of fear and confusion. Brandon backed away as if Audrey were a wild animal that had broken loose. And then a hand slid a clamp into Audrey's line of sight. Maggie Chen, the veteran nurse, stood there, calm eyes, steady hands, offering the instrument as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Size 2, Maggie said, her voice low and certain. "Do it." Audrey didn't thank her. There wasn't time. She took the clamp with her free hand, and with a precision forged by hundreds of repetitions in the worst conditions imaginable, she guided it into the wound and clamped the torn artery. The spray of blood stopped. Audrey slowly withdrew her hand, her eyes fixed on the monitor. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, and then, like a miracle, the flat line began to jump. Beep, beep, beep. The heartbeat returned, weak, slow, but there. Now, Audrey said, her voice low and exhausted. You can deal with the chest wound. She stepped back and looked down at her hands. They were dark red, blood running down to her wrists and dripping onto the floor. She heard the whispers around her, felt the stunned, fearful stares pinned on her. But she didn't care. Audrey turned and walked out of Trauma Bay 1, leaving behind a deadly silence and a man who had just been pulled back from the edge of death. She didn't say a word. Outside the glass, the bearded man, Cole Brennan, stood there. He'd seen everything, and his eyes followed Audrey as she disappeared into the corridor's shadows, as if he'd just witnessed something he'd never forget. The next morning, the sun rose and brought an entirely new story, a story in which Audrey Cole didn't exist at all. Dr. Richard Mercer's Instagram post went up at 7 in the morning, a photo of him standing in front of the hospital in a spotless white coat, smiling brightly, with a caption carefully written, "Last night was a long night, a critical patient with 3 gunshot wounds, and everyone thought there was no hope, but we didn't give up. Another life saved. Hashtag blessed. Hashtag trauma surgeon. Hashtag St. Mercy Hospital." The post collected thousands of likes within the first few hours. Local news pages reposted it with sensational headlines. Hero doctor saves prominent businessman during horrific night. No one knew who the prominent businessman was, but everyone knew the man who saved him was Dr. Richard Mercer. And not a single person, not a single line, mentioned the nurse who had actually pulled that man back from death. Audrey read the article on her phone while she sat alone in the locker room, in the dark. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't angry. She only felt bone-deep tired, as though each passing day drained a little more of whatever life she had left. When she stepped into the nurse's break room to grab her things for a new shift, laughter greeted her like a familiar wave. Vanessa Hall sat on the sofa, phone in hand, scrolling through the comments on Mercer's post with obvious delight. Brandon Price stood nearby with a coffee cup, his eyes lighting up when he saw Audrey come in. "Oh, look who's here," Brandon said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Our nurse. Did you see the news this morning? Dr. Mercer's a hero. Saved a patient everyone thought would die." Vanessa giggled and didn't even bother looking up from her phone. Good thing Dr. Mercer was there. If anyone else had handled it, that patient would have been dead a long time ago. Right, Audrey? Audrey didn't answer. She walked straight to her locker, unlocked it, and pulled out her coat and bag. Her hands trembled a little, but she fought it down. She wouldn't let them see she'd been touched. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. As she turned to leave, a hand brushed her elbow, gentle and light. Maggie Chen stood there, her aged face lined with years, her eyes sharp with concern. She didn't speak. She only tilted her head toward the hallway. Audrey followed Maggie out, to a shadowed corner near the fire stairs where no one could overhear them. Maggie turned back and looked straight into Audrey's eyes. "I saw what you did last night," Maggie said, her voice soft but firm. "I handed you the clamp, remember? I know who really saved that man." Audrey swallowed. "What are you trying to say?" "You should tell the truth," Maggie said. "You should let people know what actually happened in Trauma Bay 1. Mercer is stealing your credit, and you're letting him do it." Audrey let out a dry laugh with no warmth in it. "Who's going to believe me, Maggie? Who am I? I'm a murderer, remember? I'm the nurse who got fired for neglecting a patient. I'm the walking corpse this hospital pities enough to employ." She shook her head. "If I stand up and say I saved him, not Mercer, they'll laugh in my face. They'll say I'm jealous, I'm crazy, I want to steal someone else's glory, and then they'll throw me out on the street." Maggie fell silent, because she knew Audrey was right. Truth had no value when no one wanted to hear it. And in this world, people like Audrey were always invisible. Somewhere else in the hospital, in the cramped security room filled with screens and recording equipment, Cole Brennan sat alone. He'd been there for the past 2 hours, rewinding and replaying the footage from the Trauma Bay 1 camera. He saw everything. He saw Mercer panic, saw the team collapse, saw the monitor flatline, and he saw the slim nurse with green eyes stride in like a storm, shove everyone aside, and save his boss's life with her bare hands. Cole pulled out his phone and made a call. "Boss," he said when the other line picked up, "I found what you need to know. The person who saved you wasn't that doctor showing up on TV. It was a nurse. Her name is Audrey Cole, and you're going to want to hear her story." The call came at 2 in the afternoon, right in the middle of Audrey's shift. A cold voice from Human Resources informed her that she needed to report to the director's office immediately, with no delay and no questions, and no explanation. Audrey knew this was coming. She'd known it from the moment she shoved open the door to Trauma Bay 1 and stepped inside. She just hadn't thought it would come so fast. Director George Whitmore's office was on the top floor of the hospital, where the carpets were thick, the chandeliers were crystal, and expensive paintings hung on the walls. When Audrey walked in, she saw 3 people waiting for her. Whitmore sat behind an oak desk, his face as cold as stone. Beside him was a middle-aged woman with black-framed glasses, who Audrey assumed was the HR manager, and standing in the corner, arms crossed over his chest with a smile he couldn't hide, was Dr. Richard Mercer. Audrey felt her stomach tighten. "Sit down, Miss Cole," Whitmore said, his voice stripped of emotion. Audrey sat in the chair across from the desk. She felt like she was on trial, like a criminal awaiting sentence. And maybe, in their eyes, she was. "We've received an official report from Dr. Mercer," Whitmore continued, looking down at a file on his desk, regarding what happened last night in Trauma Bay 1. He lifted his gaze and looked straight into Audrey's eyes. "Can you explain why you entered a surgical room without authorization, pushed the lead physician aside, and performed a medical procedure you're not certified to perform?" Audrey opened her mouth to speak, but Mercer cut in. "She interfered with my surgery," Mercer said, his tone thick with manufactured outrage. "I had the situation under control. I was preparing to clamp the artery, and she stormed in like a lunatic. She shoved me, shoved the head nurse, and stuck her hand into the patient's wound without gloves. That's a severe violation of sterile protocol. That's reckless behavior that could cause a deadly infection." Audrey felt heat rush into her face. "That's a lie," she said, her voice shaking but still fighting for calm. "The patient flatlined. He was dying from a carotid artery wound no one saw. I saved his life." "You saved his life?" Mercer scoffed. "With your history? You're the nurse who got fired for neglecting a patient to death. You're the one your old hospital blamed for murder. And now you're standing here saying you saved a patient, while I, the head physician with 20 years of experience, was useless?" He turned to Whitmore. "You see, George, she's not just dangerous. She's delusional." Whitmore sighed as if this were an inconvenience he wanted to end as quickly as possible. "Miss Cole," he said, "given your history at Memorial General, last night's incident, and Dr. Mercer's report, the hospital cannot continue to employ you. We have no choice but to terminate your contract, effective immediately." Audrey felt the floor drop out from under her. "Please," she said, her voice catching, "I have a sister in treatment. She has lupus. The hospital bills are $15,000 a month. If I lose my job, I can't." She couldn't finish. Tears were rising, and she held them back with everything she had left. "That isn't the hospital's concern," Whitmore said, his tone unmoved. "Please surrender your employee badge." Slowly, Audrey raised her hand to her neck and unclipped the badge. The little piece of plastic was small, but it weighed like the whole world in her palm. She set it on the desk, and in that moment, she saw Mercer smile. Not a victorious smile, a smile like a man who'd just crushed an ant under his shoe and felt satisfied by it. 2 security guards waited outside the office door. They fell in on either side of Audrey and escorted her down the hallway as if she were a criminal being marched to execution. And maybe that was exactly what they wanted. A public execution to warn anyone who dared challenge the order of things. The main lobby was crowded at this hour. Doctors, nurses, patients, families, all of them stopped and stared as Audrey passed. Rumors spread faster than any infection. Everyone knew the crazy nurse had stormed into the OR and almost killed the VIP patient. Everyone knew she'd been fired, and everyone wanted to witness the moment she got thrown into the street. "Goodbye, murderer." Brandon Price's voice rang out from somewhere in the crowd, loud and clear enough for everyone to hear. Laughter erupted like a wave, rolling from one person to the next, echoing down the corridor with naked cruelty. Audrey lowered her head, her eyes fixed on the floor, but she kept walking. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. She didn't stop. She didn't cry. She didn't give them that satisfaction. At the end of the hallway, near the doors, Maggie Chen stood there. She didn't say a word. She only looked at Audrey with eyes full of grief, and slowly shook her head. She wanted to help. Audrey knew that, but she couldn't. No one could. Audrey walked through the glass doors into the blinding afternoon sun. She didn't turn back. She didn't look back at the building that had tossed her aside like trash. She just kept walking, alone, while the world collapsed around her. The rain started to fall as if the sky wanted to cry for her. Audrey stood under the hospital's awning, cradling a small cardboard box that held everything she had after 6 months at Sreet: Mercy, an old coat, a spare pair of socks, and a photograph of Penny. The rain slanted in beneath the awning, soaking her shoulders, but she didn't bother to move deeper into cover. She didn't have the strength to do anything anymore. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Audrey pulled it out and looked at the screen, and her heart tightened when she saw the caller's name. Penny. Her little sister was calling, maybe to check on her, maybe to talk about today at the hospital, maybe to say she missed her. But Audrey couldn't pick up. She couldn't tell Penny she'd just lost her job. She couldn't tell her she didn't know where the money would come from to pay next month's bills. She couldn't let Penny hear her voice shake and realize that the sister she'd always trusted was falling apart. Audrey hit decline and shoved the phone back into her pocket. Tears mixed with rain on her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She stood there in the storm like a forgotten ghost, and then a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop right in front of her. Not an ordinary car, but the kind you only saw in movies about kingpins and dangerous men. The door opened, and the bearded man Audrey had seen the night before stepped out. Cole Brennan. He was built like a rock, and even in the rain, he carried a threat that made people want to step back. But Audrey didn't. She'd lost everything. What was there left to fear? "Miss Cole," Cole said, his voice low and serious. "My boss wants to see you." Audrey looked at him, rain still falling across her face. "I know who your boss is," she said, her voice rough. "Rhett Blackwood, the Mafia boss, the man all of Chicago is afraid of." Cole didn't deny it. He just stood there, waiting. "Why does he want to see me?" Audrey asked. "To kill me for touching him without permission. To punish me because I saw his face." Cole studied her for a long moment, and Audrey could have sworn she caught something in his eyes that looked almost like respect. "If he wanted to hurt you," Cole said slowly, "you wouldn't be standing here talking to me." Silence. The rain kept falling. Audrey looked at the black SUV, then back at the hospital behind her. A tall building lit bright, the place where she'd worked, where she'd been humiliated, where she'd saved a life and been thrown out like trash. No one inside cared about her. No one would remember her. She turned back to Cole. "All right," she said. "I'll go." Cole opened the rear door for her, and Audrey climbed in, still holding the soaked cardboard box. The interior was warm and smelled of expensive leather. She settled into the seat, and the door closed, sealing her off from the world outside. Cole slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The SUV moved smoothly through the streets of Chicago, and Audrey stared out the window, watching Street. Mercy shrink in the rearview mirror until it became nothing but a dim point of light in the rain. "Do you know why he wants to see you?" Cole asked, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. Audrey shook her head, even though she knew he couldn't see it. "No. He watched the security footage," Cole said. "He replayed the Trauma Bay 1 video over and over. He saw everything." Audrey felt her pulse quicken. "Everything. Everything," Cole confirmed. "He saw that doctor panic like a headless chicken. He saw the team fall apart, and he saw you walk in, shove everyone aside, and save his life with your bare hands." He paused for a beat. "He knows who really saved him, Miss Cole, and he isn't the kind of man who forgets a debt." Rhett Blackwood's penthouse sat on the top floor of one of the most expensive skyscrapers in Chicago, the kind of place where a single night's stay cost what Audrey made in a year. When the private elevator doors opened and she stepped out, she felt as if she'd wandered into a different world, a world of power, of cold luxury, and of secrets that could get you killed. The penthouse was vast, with high ceilings, glossy black marble floors, and glass walls that looked out over the entire city. Lights blinking beneath the night. There wasn't much furniture, only minimalist pieces that were still unmistakably expensive, and the air felt cold in a way Audrey couldn't quite explain, as if the room itself were a reflection of its owner, and that owner was sitting on a black leather sofa in the center of the living room, waiting for her. Rhett Blackwood looked nothing like the unconscious, blood-drenched man she'd seen the night before. He sat upright, his left shoulder wrapped in white bandage visible beneath a black shirt left open at the collar, and his gray eyes pinned her in place as if he were trying to read every thought in her mind. They were eyes cold as steel, the eyes of someone who'd stared at death too many times to fear it anymore. Audrey stopped a few meters away, still clutching the soaked cardboard box against her chest like a useless shield. She didn't know what she should say or do. She just stood there and waited. Rhett didn't rise. He only watched her for a long moment, then picked up a file resting on the coffee table in front of him. Audrey Marie Cole, he read, his voice low and unhurried. 28 years old, born in the Chicago suburbs. Mother died of cancer when you were 12. Father, alcoholic, abusive, left when you were 15. He turned the next page without looking up, enlisted at 18 to pay for school. Served 4 years with a forward medical unit in Afghanistan. 127 emergency cases under combat conditions. Commended for bravery. Discharged at 22 for psychological trauma. He kept flipping. Your sister, Penny Cole, 22 years old, being treated for lupus at Chicago General. Hospital costs $15,000 a month. You owe $47,000 and have no way to pay it. He closed the file and finally lifted his gaze to her. 6 months ago, you were framed for a patient's death at Memorial General. You were fired, nearly lost your license, and branded a murderer. No one believed you. No one stood with you. Audrey felt flayed open. Every secret, every ache, everything she'd tried to bury was in that file, being recited by a stranger as if her life were an open book. She wanted to be angry, wanted to ask what right he had to dig through her private life, but she didn't have the strength. She only stood there in silence and waited. I have a question, Rhett said, setting the file down. Why did you save me? Audrey blinked. What? You know who I am, Rhett said, his voice flat. All of Chicago knows who I am. They call me a devil, a kingpin, a murderer. And you, a nurse branded a killer, risked everything to rush into a trauma room and save another killer. Why? Audrey looked straight into those cold gray eyes. She thought of everything she could say. Long explanations about professional ethics, about instinct, about years of training. But in the end, she told the simplest truth. Because it's what I was trained to do, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Save lives, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done. When someone is dying in front of me, I don't ask whether they deserve to live. I just do my job. Silence. Rhett watched her, and for the first time, Audrey saw something shift in his eyes. Not warmth, not gentleness, but maybe surprise, as if he'd asked this question before and had never heard an answer like that. You got fired for saving me, Rhett said after a long moment. That doctor blamed you, and the hospital threw you into the street. You lost everything just for doing the right thing. Audrey didn't speak. She didn't need to confirm what they both already knew was true. Then I owe you, Rhett said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a black business card with silver lettering. He set it on the table and slid it toward her. My private nurse. $30,000 a month. Full coverage for your sister's treatment. Starting now. Audrey stared at the card, then looked back up at Rhett. She wasn't sure she'd heard him right. Why? She asked, her voice rough. Why would you help me? I'm just a nurse. I have nothing. You saved my life, Rhett said simply. That's the only reason I need. Audrey stepped forward, slowly set the cardboard box on the floor, and picked up the business card. Her hand trembled, not with fear, but with something else. For the past 6 months, she'd been called a murderer. She'd been betrayed, abandoned, thrown away like trash. No one believed her. No one stood with her. And now, the man the world called a devil was the first one to see the truth, the first one to believe her. Tears rose in Audrey's eyes, but she forced them back. She looked down at the card in her hand, then lifted her gaze to Rhett. When do I start? She asked. 2 weeks passed like a strange dream. Audrey never believed she'd be allowed to live. Every day, she woke up in a private room in the penthouse, a room larger than her old apartment, with a soft mattress and a view of the Chicago skyline. Every day, she went to Rhett's room to change his dressings, check his wounds, and force him to take his medication as if he were a stubborn child, instead of the most powerful Mafia boss in the city. And every day, they argued. Rhett was the worst patient Audrey had ever met. He refused to stay still, refused to rest, refused to admit his body needed time to heal. He tried to get up and work while his wounds were barely closed, tried to read files and bark orders at his men as if he hadn't almost died 2 weeks ago. And Audrey, just as hard-headed, shoved him back into bed every time. Lie down right now, she said, her voice leaving no room for compromise. "Or I'll have Cole tie you down." Rhett stared at her with a look that would have made anyone else drop to their knees. But Audrey didn't flinch. And in the end, he was always the one who gave in first. Late night was when everything changed. When the penthouse sank into darkness, and only the city's dim glow spilled in from outside, they sat in the living room, not sleeping, not speaking, just staring into the night. And little by little, they started to talk. Rhett told her about his mother, a gentle woman with black hair and a warm smile. Caruso, the boss of a rival crew, had ordered her killed when Rhett was 14, simply because his father refused to bow. He told Audrey about that night, about gunfire, about blood on the floor, about the way he held his mother's body in his arms, and swore he'd become someone no one would ever dare touch again. Audrey listened, and then she told him about her own mother, about the brutal cancer, about the nights her mother cried from pain while Audrey could only sit beside her, helpless, about the day her mother died because the family couldn't afford the medication, because insurance refused to pay, because the healthcare system treated poor people like trash. She didn't cry as she spoke. She'd used up her tears years ago. They found common ground in those losses. Both of them had lost their mothers too soon. Both of them had been forced to stand up on their own, in a world that offered no mercy. Both of them had built walls around their hearts, so no one could hurt them again. A week after that, Sienna came to visit. Rhett's sister was a 24-year-old woman with wavy brown hair and bright, sparkling eyes, in her final year of medical school. And she didn't know much about her brother's real work. Sienna looked at Audrey with open curiosity as Audrey changed Rhett's bandage. "Are you my brother's new nurse?" Sienna asked, an innocent smile on her lips. "He's never let anyone stay that close for long. Usually after a week, he kicks them out." Audrey didn't know what to say, so she only offered a small smile. But she noticed Rhett watching her, and there was something in his gaze she couldn't read. That night, as Audrey sat in the living room reading, a door slammed somewhere in the penthouse. She jolted, the book slipping from her hands, her heart racing, her hands shaking. For a moment, she wasn't in Chicago anymore. She was in Kandahar, in the middle of explosions and screaming. When she came back to herself, she saw Rhett standing in the doorway of the living room, watching her with quiet gray eyes. He didn't ask. He didn't need to ask. He understood, because he carried invisible wounds, too. The morning of the 15th day began with urgent knocking and the strained face of Finn Gallagher, the tech specialist of the Blackwood Empire. He was a 30-year-old man with messy hair and eyes that usually lived on a computer screen. But today those eyes were full of worry as he stepped into Rhett's office. Audrey was changing Rhett's bandage when Finn and Cole came in together, and she knew at once something was wrong from the look on their faces. "Boss," Finn said, his voice fast and tight. "We've got a problem. I just tracked Neil Ashford's phone signal. He's still in Chicago." Rhett shot to his feet, ignoring Audrey's protests about wounds that weren't healed yet. His gray eyes darkened like a sky before a storm. Neil Ashford, his closest advisor, the man he'd trusted like a brother, was the one who'd sold him out to Caruso, the one who'd led him into the ambush that nearly killed him 2 weeks ago. "He didn't run like we thought," Finn went on. "He's still here. And there's more. 10 SUVs registered under Frank Caruso's shell companies rolled into the city overnight. I checked. They're all armored." Cole stepped forward, his face more serious than Audrey had ever seen it. "Boss, they're gearing up to hit us. Not next week. Not tomorrow. It could be within 24 hours. The room sank into a heavy silence. Audrey stood there with the roll of gauze still in her hand, feeling the air thicken around her. She'd heard enough about Frank Caruso over the past 2 weeks to understand he was Rhett's sworn enemy, the man who'd ordered Rhett's mother killed years ago, and the kind of man who wouldn't stop until one of them was in the ground. Rhett turned to Cole, his voice cold and clean as a blade. "Prep an evacuation to the safe house. Call all our people. I want weapons and ammo ready within 1 hour." Cole nodded and turned to go, but Rhett called him back. "And Cole," Rhett said, his eyes flicking toward Audrey. "Prep a separate car for Miss Cole. Get her somewhere safe first." Audrey felt like she'd been slapped. She turned to Rhett, not believing what she'd heard. "What?" "You heard me," Rhett said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Cole will take you to a safe place, far from Chicago. You'll stay there until this is over." "No," Audrey said, her voice clear and final. Rhett, Cole, and Finn all turned toward her in surprise. Nobody said no to Rhett Blackwood. Nobody dared. "You're not fully recovered," Audrey said as she stepped closer, stopping right in front of Rhett. "The shoulder wound is still healing. The abdominal wound has barely scabbed over. If you move too much, if you fight, it could tear open and you could bleed to death. Who's going to take care of you if I'm gone?" Rhett looked at her, his gray eyes brightening with something hard to read. "This is my war," he said, his voice low and grave. "Not yours. You don't belong in this world. You shouldn't be here when the bullets start flying." Audrey took another step, meeting his gaze head-on, not flinching from the look that could freeze a room. "You can give orders to half of Chicago," she said, her voice calm but hard as steel. "You can make anyone kneel with a nod. But you can't order me to abandon my patient. I'm your nurse. My job is to keep you alive. And I'm going to do that job, whether you like it or not." Silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Cole and Finn stood perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for the fury that should have come down on the woman who'd just challenged their boss. But it didn't come. Instead, Rhett watched Audrey for a long moment, and then something strange happened. The corner of his mouth lifted, a small, rare smile like a shaft of sunlight through storm clouds. "Stubborn," he said, and his voice wasn't cold anymore. There was something in it that sounded almost like admiration. Audrey didn't back down. "You say that like it's a bad thing," she replied. "They didn't have 24 hours. They didn't even have 24 minutes. Everything happened too fast, too suddenly, like someone hit a switch and the whole world flipped upside down in a single instant." Audrey was standing in the living room, watching Rhett give orders to his crew over the phone, when every light in the penthouse died at once. Darkness slammed down like a massive black blanket, swallowing everything in sight. Audrey couldn't see anything, couldn't even see her own hand held up in front of her face, and for one terrifying moment she felt as if she were falling freely into nothingness. Then the gunfire erupted. Not one shot, but a sustained burst from the floors below, rolling up through the stairwell and vibrating through the building like doomsday thunder. Audrey felt someone seize her arm and yank her backward. The familiar scent of sandalwood told her it was Rhett. "Get down," he snarled, and his voice was nothing like the calm man she'd come to know over the past 2 weeks. This was the voice of a fighter, a survivor. The living room doors flew open and Cole Brennan charged in, the beam of a tactical flashlight mounted on his weapon slicing across the room. His face was slick with sweat and so tight with strain Audrey could see the cords in his neck. "Breach!" Cole shouted. "The elevator's compromised. They're forcing the stairs. They're coming from both directions." Rhett moved before Cole even finished. He yanked a handgun from a desk drawer, checked the magazine, and racked the slide with the clean speed of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "How many?" he asked, his voice ice cold. "At least 20, Cole answered. "And boss, Tony the Butcher is leading. I saw him on the stairs." Audrey saw Rhett's jaw clamp down. Tony Ricci, called the Butcher, was Frank Caruso's most notorious killer, a man rumored to prefer knives over guns because he wanted to feel his victims die in his hands. If Caruso sent Tony, it meant he wanted Rhett to die slowly. Rhett turned to Audrey, and in the broken, shifting dark, she could see his gray eyes flare like a wolf's. "Panic room," he said, leaving no space for argument. "Behind the bookcase in my bedroom. There's a hidden button under the 3rd shelf. You go in there and you don't come out no matter what happens. Do you understand me?" Audrey wanted to argue. She wanted to say she wasn't the type to hide in the dark while other people fought, but she also knew she had no weapon, no skill for bullets and guns, and her presence here would only distract Rhett. So she nodded and ran for the bedroom. She found the button, the secret door slid open, and she stepped into a small armored room lit by the dim glow of security monitors. She shut the door and stared at the screens, her heart hammering hard in her chest. What she saw on the cameras made her blood turn cold. Caruso's men flooded into the penthouse like black ants, weapons raised, moving with the tight coordination of professionals. Cole and Rhett's team fired back from behind makeshift barricades, the shots cracking like lethal fireworks. A smoke grenade was thrown, and thick white haze swallowed the living room. Audrey couldn't see clearly anymore, only dark shapes shifting inside the fog, and muzzle flashes sparking like fireflies from hell. Then she saw Cole. He was firing toward the stairwell when 2 shots punched through the smoke and slammed into his abdomen. Cole staggered, his weapon slipping from his hand, and he went down like a tree being cut at the base. Blood began to spread beneath him, a dark pool on the black and white camera feed. "No," Audrey whispered, pressing her hand to the screen as if she could reach him through the glass. No, no, no. On another monitor, she saw Rhett. He was fighting like a cornered animal, dropping one attacker after another. But there were too many, and he was being surrounded. The shoulder wound began to seep through his shirt, and Audrey could see he was weakening. Then the smoke thinned, and a figure stepped out. Tony Ricci. He was big, bald, with a grin so wide it looked like a cut across his face. A pistol hung in his hand, and he walked straight toward Rhett with the confidence of a man who already knew he'd won. Rhett lifted his gun, but a dry click sounded. Empty. Tony laughed, and the sound came through the panic room speakers and made Audrey shiver. "Hello, Blackwood," Tony said, his voice like nails dragged across a chalkboard. "Caruso sends his regards." He raised the pistol and aimed it straight at Rhett's head. Audrey stood inside the panic room, eyes locked on the security monitors, and the world around her seemed to stop turning. She saw Cole lying motionless on the floor, blood spreading into a dark pool beneath his body. She saw Rhett backed into a corner of the wall, his gun empty, the wound in his shoulder bleeding through his shirt. And she saw Tony Ricci standing there, a pistol aimed at the head of the man she'd cared for these past 2 weeks, the killer's smile opening on his mouth like a raw wound. And in that moment, Audrey wasn't in Chicago anymore. She was in Kandahar, 4 years ago. Inside a medical tent, thick with blood and screaming, she saw Sergeant Williams, 23 years old, newly married, lying on a stretcher with a through-and-through chest wound. She was trying to stop the bleeding, trying to keep him alive. But the blood kept coming, and she couldn't stop it. And Williams looked at her with blue eyes already fading, whispering his wife's name one last time before his breath quit. She didn't save him. She was too late, not fast enough, not good enough. And he died in her hands, like so many others who'd died in her hands on that murderous ground. No. The roar tore through Audrey's head, ripping apart the fog of memory and dragging her back to the present. Not again. She didn't think. She didn't weigh anything. The soldier's instinct in her took over completely, yanking her out of paralysis and dropping her into survival. She scanned the panic room and saw it, a red fire extinguisher hanging on the wall. She yanked it down, keepsake heavy and familiar in her grip, and she opened the door. The living room was still full of smoke and the bitter smell of gunpowder. Audrey moved like a ghost, bare feet on black marble, her heart beating slow and steady to a rhythm the army had drilled into her bones. She heard Tony's voice from ahead. "Any last words, Blackwood?" Tony asked, his tone thick with the pleasure of a man about to savor victory. "Caruso wants me to send you one last hello before you meet your mommy in hell." Audrey saw Rhett braced against the wall, his face pale from blood loss but his gray eyes still cold, still unafraid. He stared Tony down, and a small smile touched his mouth. "Yeah," Rhett said, his voice strangely calm. "Behind you." Tony hadn't even turned when metal met bone with a bell-like crack. Clang. The fire extinguisher smashed into Tony's skull with every ounce of strength Audrey could summon. The killer staggered, his gun dropped from his hand, and he went down on the floor with a groan of pain. But Audrey didn't have time to celebrate. 3 other Caruso soldiers were in the room, and they'd already swung their guns toward her. She cut left the instant the first bullet tore through the spot where she'd just been. She rolled across the floor, brought the extinguisher down on the nearest man's knee. He screamed and collapsed, and Audrey snatched up his gun before he could recover. The second man lunged at her, but Audrey had been trained in Krav Maga in the military. She used his momentum, turned, and drove her elbow into his face. His nose broke with a sick crack, blood burst out, and he stumbled back. Audrey didn't stop. She pulled the surgical knife she always kept in her pocket, a habit from the battlefield, and she cut the tendon in the hand of the man reaching for his weapon. He howled and dropped the gun. The third man fired at her, but Audrey slid behind the sofa. She fired back, not at his head or chest, but at his leg. The bullet punched through his thigh and he went down, his gun skittering away. She didn't kill them. She only disabled them. She was still a nurse, not an assassin. But Tony Ricci didn't go down as easily as the others. The killer got back up, blood running from the wound on his head, his eyes burning with a mad fury. He drew a dagger from his belt, long and curved. The blade people whispered had taken dozens of lives. "You," Tony growled, charging at Audrey. "I'm gonna carve you up." He was faster than Audrey expected. His knife came down, and she couldn't fully get clear. The blade sliced across her arm, leaving a long, deep wound pouring blood. She clenched her jaw against the pain. No scream, no retreat. When Tony struck again, she was ready. She used his forward rush, caught the knife wrist, turned, and threw him over her shoulder with a judo move she'd practiced 1,000 times. Tony hit the floor with a heavy thud, the air knocked out of his lungs, and before he could find himself again, Audrey planted her foot on his neck, the stolen gun aimed straight at his head. "Don't move," Audrey said, her voice ice-cold and not shaking at all. Her eyes pinned the killer beneath her, and in that moment, she wasn't a bullied nurse anymore. She was Lieutenant Audrey Cole, a battlefield nurse, the one who'd survived hell and made it back. The gunfire began to fade, like thunder rolling away as a storm withdrew. Caruso's men, the ones still alive and still able to stand, pulled back through the stairs and the elevator, leaving behind their wounded and their commander pinned beneath a woman with a gun aimed at his head. Audrey didn't take her eyes off Tony until Jace Monroe, one of Rhett's bodyguards who was still on his feet, ran in with a coil of rope. She stepped aside so Jace could bind Tony. His wrists and ankles cinched so tight he couldn't move, and only then did she lower the gun and turn to sprint toward Cole. Cole Brennan was still there, in a pool of his own blood, eyes squeezed shut, his chest rising in shallow, fragile breaths. Audrey dropped to her knees beside him, both hands pressing down over the abdominal wounds with as much force as she could summon. Warm blood slipped through her fingers, and she felt Cole's abdominal muscles twitch beneath her palms. "Cole!" Audrey called, her voice sharp and commanding. "Cole, open your eyes. Look at me." Cole groaned, his eyelids fluttering, then cracking open. His gaze was unfocused, already drifting, but he still found her. "You, nurse," he rasped, his voice raw with blood loss. "That's right. I'm your nurse," Audrey said, pressing harder. "And you don't get to die without my permission. Do you hear me? Don't close your eyes. Look at me." She whipped her head up and shouted at anyone who could hear. "Call an ambulance. Now. And bring me clean towels. Anything I can use to stop the bleeding." Finn appeared at her side with a stack of white towels, and Audrey stuffed them into the wound, packed hard, trying to slow the terrifying rush of blood. She'd done this hundreds of times in Afghanistan, with injuries worse than this. But every time felt like the first time. Every time was a fight between life and death, and she never knew which side would win. "Don't die on me, Cole," Audrey whispered, her eyes locked on the man slipping away. "You still owe me a thank you for saving your boss. You don't get to die before you pay your debt." Cole tried to smile, but it came out as a pained groan. The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes, though to Audrey those 10 minutes felt like 10 years. When the paramedics rushed in with a stretcher and gear, Audrey didn't let go. She rose with them, kept pressure on the wound, and started giving orders like she was the commanding officer, and they were troops under her. Male, 34, 2 gunshot wounds to the abdomen, massive blood loss, blood pressure dropping. Start fluids immediately and prep the OR on arrival. Move fast but steady. Don't jostle the wound any more than you have to. The paramedics stared at her, startled, but they followed without argument. There was something in her voice, in her eyes, that told them she knew exactly what she was doing. Cole was loaded onto the stretcher and pushed into the ambulance. Audrey watched the doors slam, watched the vehicle pull away, sirens screaming into the night, and she prayed silently it wouldn't be the last time she saw him alive. Then she turned back. The penthouse looked like a battlefield. Bodies of wounded attackers sprawled across the floor, bullet scars punched into the walls, the air thick with blood and gunpowder. And in the middle of all that chaos, Rhett Blackwood sat braced against the wall, one hand clamped over his bleeding shoulder, gray eyes fixed on her without blinking. Audrey crossed to him and lowered herself beside him. She didn't speak. She simply began to assess the damage. The stitches at his shoulder had torn, and blood seeped out in a slow, steady flow. She opened the medical kit she always carried and started to dress the wound in silence, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Rhett watched her. He watched her brown hair hanging loose and tangled, dusted with debris. He watched her face, smeared with an enemy's blood and maybe her own. He watched her arm, the cut Tony's knife had left still bleeding, and she didn't seem to care. And he watched her eyes, green and calm, as if she were in an operating room instead of the aftermath of a firefight. "Who are you?" Rhett asked, his voice rough. "Who are you really, before you became a nurse?" Audrey paused. She looked down at the half-wrapped bandage, then at her own bloodied hands. She was quiet for a long moment, as if searching for the right answer among 1,000 possible ones. "I used to be the person people called when they wanted to survive," she said at last, her voice low and exhausted. "And I'm tired of that job. I thought when I became a civilian nurse, I could save people in peace." She lifted her gaze to his, a sad flicker of a smile crossing her mouth. "But it looks like peace can't find me." 2 days after the attack, when the penthouse had been cleaned and repaired, when Cole was out of immediate danger and recovering in the hospital, Rhett Blackwood sat alone in his office with a file in his hands. It wasn't the file she'd given the hospital. Not the clean, simple resume Audrey Cole had built to hide her past. This was the real military record. The one Finn had spent all night hacking out of the Department of Defense system. Rhett read every page, every line, and with each word he understood a little more about the woman who'd saved his life twice. Lieutenant Audrey Marie Cole, Forward Medical Unit 274, served in Afghanistan from 18 to 22. 4 years in hell. 127 emergency cases under combat conditions, the highest number in her entire unit. Commendation for bravery. Awarded for saving 3 soldiers during an ambush on a classified mission whose details were still restricted. And finally, medical discharge. Diagnosis: PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The military psychologist's note read, "The patient experiences persistent nightmares, startled responses to loud noises, and profound guilt over comrades she was unable to save." Rhett closed the file and shut his eyes. He thought about the way her hands trembled whenever a sound came too suddenly. He thought about the distant look in her gaze when night fell and memory came crashing in. He thought about the way she'd fought that night, calm and exact like a machine. And he understood that calm wasn't the absence of feeling. It was what happened after years of learning to push, feeling aside so she could do what had to be done. The office door opened, and Audrey stepped in with a medication tray. She was about to speak, probably to remind him to take his pills, but her eyes landed on the file on the desk. She recognized it instantly, the Department of Defense seal, the Army insignia, and she understood. The tray slipped from her hands, clattering across the floor, but she didn't care. She crossed the room, snatched the file from Rhett's grasp, and her eyes flared with a fury he'd never seen in her before. "Who gave you the right?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "Who gave you the right to dig through my past? This is classified. This is my life." Rhett rose to face her. He didn't back down from her anger, but he didn't answer it with anger either. "I needed to know who's standing beside me," he said, his voice low and serious. "You've saved my life twice. You fought like a soldier to protect me and my people. I needed to understand why." Silence. Audrey stood there with the file trembling in her hands, and Rhett could see the wall she'd built around herself beginning to crack. She looked down at the pages, at the cold numbers and colder words that recorded the 4 worst years of her life, and suddenly she couldn't hold it anymore. Tears began to spill, not a few drops sliding down her cheeks, but a flood breaking loose from eyes she'd forced dry for so many years. She cried, for the first time since leaving Afghanistan, for the first time in front of another person since her mother died. "They called me a hero," Audrey said through sobs. "They gave me medals. They said I saved lives. But they don't know. They don't know about the people I couldn't save." She collapsed into a chair, the file slipping from her fingers. "There are nights I can hear them calling my name. Williams, 23, newly married, died because I couldn't stop the bleeding in time. Rodriguez, 19, hadn't even kissed a girl, died because I chose to save someone else first. Thompson, 20, had a little sister waiting at home, died in my hands calling for his mother." She lifted her head to Rhett, eyes red and raw with pain. "I carry them for the rest of my life. Every night, every dream. I'm a hero? No. I'm a survivor. And sometimes surviving hurts more than dying." Rhett stood there, uncertain in a way he wasn't used to. He was a Mafia boss. He gave orders that ended lives. He faced enemies without blinking. But he didn't know how to comfort a woman who was crying. He wasn't familiar with this kind of softness, with watching someone else's pain and having no way to fix it with bullets or money. But he stepped closer. He put a hand on her shoulder, awkward and unpracticed, and he said the only thing he could. "I hear them too," Rhett said, his voice low and far away. "The people I lost. My mother, my father, the ones who died because of me, or because of my choices. They never go quiet." He pulled her up and held her, a gesture he didn't know he was capable of until this moment. We both carry scars, Audrey. But scars don't define us. What we do with that pain is what defines us. That night, Blackwood's men found Neil Ashford hiding in a cheap apartment on the outskirts of the city. Rhett went there with a gun in his hand and hate in his heart. Neil had sold him out to Caruso, nearly gotten him killed, betrayed everything Rhett had ever trusted. Rhett raised the gun and aimed it at the traitor's head as he knelt and begged, and then he saw Audrey standing in the corner of the room, not Mesh interfering, not judging, just watching him with eyes still red from crying. "Living with guilt sometimes hurts more than dying," she said softly. Rhett looked at her. He looked at Neil. Rhett lowered the gun. He didn't kill Neil, but he didn't let him stay. Within the hour, Cole's men escorted the traitor to the city limits with a stern warning. If he ever stepped foot in Chicago again, not even Audrey's mercy could save him. Neil Ashford was gone, cast out into the shadows of the world he had betrayed. On the drive back to the penthouse, sitting beside Audrey in the car, Rhett broke the silence. "I didn't kill him," he said, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Not because he deserved to live, but because you were watching." He turned to look at her. "I don't want you to look at me like I'm a devil." Frank Caruso wasn't a man who accepted defeat. When word of the disastrous assault on Blackwood's penthouse reached him, when he learned that Tony Ricci had been captured and more than half his elite crew had been killed or wounded by a woman, he didn't explode in rage. He sat in silence in his office, poured himself a whiskey, and thought. Rhett Blackwood had a weakness. Everyone had a weakness. And Caruso had found his enemy's weakness a long time ago. He just hadn't needed to use it. But Caruso's reach extended further than Rhett realized. Using a mole still embedded within Rhett's outer circle, Caruso had orchestrated a violent intercept during Tony's transfer to a secure location. His men had ambushed the transport, liberated a battered Tony Ricci, and brought him back to the fold, his hunger for revenge now bordering on madness. Until now. Sienna Blackwood, 24 years old, a final-year medical student, living in a university dorm, with the illusion that she was safe from her brother's dark world. She was wrong. The message came at 9 p.m, while Audrey was changing the dressing on the cut on her arm, and Rhett was reviewing security reports. Rhett's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen with his usual calm, but then his expression shifted. Audrey watched the blood drain from Rhett's face as if someone had opened a valve. She saw his gray eyes widen, then darken with something she'd never seen in him before. Fear, panic, and then rage. "Rhett?" she asked, stepping closer. "What happened?" Rhett didn't answer. He stood up, his fist closing around the phone so hard the casing began to crack, and then he hurled it at the wall. The phone shattered into 100 pieces, but Audrey had seen the screen in time. A short message, only 2 words and 3 dots. "Bro. Help." And the sender name was Sienna. Less than a minute later, Rhett's laptop received a video call. He accepted with a trembling hand, and Frank Caruso's face appeared on the screen, smiling like a man holding the decisive piece on the board. But it wasn't Caruso that made Audrey's breath catch. It was the image behind him. Sienna sat on a metal chair, her hands tied behind her back, her ankles chained to the chair legs. Her face was bruised, her lips swollen and bleeding, and her eyes were red from crying. But when she saw Rhett on the camera, she tried to smile, tried to look brave, and it squeezed Audrey's heart until it hurt. "Blackwood," Caruso said, his voice low and satisfied. "I trust you recognize this girl." Rhett didn't speak. His jaw tightened so hard Audrey could hear his teeth grind. 1 hour, Caruso went on. "The meatpacking plant on the west side. You come alone, no weapon, no men. If I see anyone else, or if you're late by even 1 minute, your sister will be sent back to you, piece by piece." The screen went black. Silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Audrey looked at Rhett and saw him standing rigid as stone, and then he began to move. He went to the weapons cabinet, opened it, and started checking his guns. "What are you going to do?" Audrey asked, even though she already knew the answer. "Go save my sister," Rhett said, his voice stripped of everything but cold determination. "It's a trap," Audrey said, stepping in front of him. "You know it's a trap. Caruso isn't going to let you walk out alive. You go in there alone, you'll die. And Sienna will die too." "I know," Rhett said. He lifted his gaze to hers, and Audrey saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Desperation, pain, and acceptance. "But she's my sister. She's the only family I have left," She's the only person in this world I still care about. He turned back to the weapons. If I don't go, she dies. If I go, at least there's a chance. Audrey watched him for a long moment, and then she made her decision. I'm coming with you, she said. Rhett turned, shaking his head immediately. No. No way. You stay here. Sienna could be badly hurt, Audrey said, her voice calm and unyielding. She needs a nurse. She needs someone who can keep her alive until she gets to a hospital. She stepped closer, stopping right in front of Rhett, meeting the storm in his gray eyes without flinching. And so do you. The meatpacking plant sat in the West Side Industrial District, a building abandoned for years, its walls rusted through, and the stench of blood and metal still haunting every corner. When Rhett and Audrey stepped through the front doors exactly as Caruso demanded, that smell hit them like a warning of what was coming. Inside, the weak glow of old industrial lights barely reached the floor, casting long, frightening shadows between rows of meat hooks hanging from the ceiling. And in the middle of the vast room, Sienna sat on a metal chair, bound at the wrists and ankles, her face bruised and wet with tears. 15 of Caruso's men stood around her with guns in hand, and at the center was Frank Caruso in an expensive suit, wearing the smile of a man who thought he'd already won. Beside him stood Tony Ricci, the man Audrey had thought was locked away, but Caruso had clearly found a way to get him out. The wound on Tony's head had been bandaged, and his eyes fixed on Audrey with pure hatred. Blackwood, Caruso said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. And the nurse. Interesting. I didn't think you'd bring her. He tilted his head, studying Audrey like she was some unusual object. You're the one who ruined my attack, aren't you? A nurse who took down an entire crew. I'll admit it, I'm impressed. Rhett didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Sienna, on her bruised face, on the fear and hope tangled together in the way she looked at him. His jaw tightened, and Audrey could feel the rage inside him, hot as lava and ready to erupt. Let my sister go, Rhett said, his voice cold as ice. This is between me and you. She has nothing to do with it. Caruso laughed, the sound echoing, sharp with malice. Nothing to do with it? She's your sister, Blackwood. She's your weakness. And I always hit the weakness. He lifted a hand, signaling his men to ready themselves. Now, we end this. And in that instant, hell broke open. An explosion thundered from the back of the plant, windows blasted outward, and smoke began to spill in. Caruso's men snapped around in panic, and in that split second of chaos, Cole, Brennan, and Blackwood's crew poured in from every direction, guns up, cutting down their enemies with ruthless precision. Rhett had planned for this. He'd known Caruso would have a trap, so he'd brought one of his own. Cole, still weak from his wound, had refused to stay behind, and led the assault anyway. Audrey didn't wait. While bullets flew and screams ripped through the air, she ran for Sienna with only one goal in her mind: get the girl out. But before she could reach her, a shadow blocked her path. Tony Ricci. He stood there with that familiar dagger in his hand, a crazed smile on his mouth, eyes burning with the need for revenge. This time you're not getting away, Tony snarled and lunged. Audrey knew she couldn't beat him with strength. Tony was bigger, stronger, trained to kill. But she had something he didn't. 4 years of staying alive in a war zone by turning whatever was around her into a weapon. She slipped the first slash, rolled aside, and grabbed one of the dangling meat hooks hanging from its chain. When Tony came again, she pivoted and used the hook like a weapon, catching it into his shoulder and yanking hard. Tony screamed, blood spraying, but he didn't stop. He drove the knife toward Audrey, and she couldn't fully get clear. The blade cut into her side, shallow but vicious, and she felt warm blood run down her hip. But she kept moving. She used Tony's forward momentum, caught the knife wrist, turned, and drove all her weight into his knee with a brutal kick. Tony lost his balance, and Audrey didn't waste the opening. She snatched up a rusted iron bar from the floor and brought it down on his head with everything she had left. Tony fell and didn't get up again. Across the plant, Rhett faced Caruso. 2 men stood opposite each other amid corpses and gunfire, and neither one had any intention of stepping back. Caruso fired first, and the bullet tore through Rhett's shoulder, right where the old wound had only just begun to heal. Rhett staggered but didn't fall. He lifted his gun, his eyes locked on the man who'd had his mother killed, the man who'd kidnapped his sister, the man who'd tried to destroy everything Rhett loved, and he pulled the trigger. 2 shots, one in the chest, one in the head. Caruso went down, his eyes still open in shock, as if he couldn't believe he'd lost. And then there was no shock left. There was nothing left. Audrey reached Sienna, pulled out her knife, cut the ropes, and wrapped the trembling girl in her arms. "You're safe," she whispered. "It's over. You're safe." Sienna sobbed, clinging to Audrey like she was the only lifeline in the sea. And then Audrey heard a body hit the floor. She turned and saw Rhett dropping to his knees, blood spilling from his shoulder, his face gone paper pale. She ran to him, caught him, and he looked at her with eyes already starting to lose focus. "Rhett, look at me. Don't close your eyes," Audrey shouted, her hand pressing hard over the bleeding wound. Rhett tried to smile, a weak, exhausted curve of his mouth. "You saved me again," he whispered, and then his eyes shut. A week passed like a blurred dream for Audrey. She spent most of it at Rhett's bedside, watching his heartbeat on the monitor, changing the dressing on his shoulder, and waiting for the moment those gray eyes would open again. When Rhett finally woke on the third day, the first thing he saw was Audrey's exhausted face, her eyes red from too little sleep, and the first thing he said was, "You look worse than I do." Audrey wanted to punch him, but instead she cried like she'd never been allowed to cry, and Rhett just lay there, weak but still lifting a hand to wipe her tears away. While Rhett recovered, Finn Gallagher didn't stop working. Before the attack, Rhett had given him one special assignment: dig into what happened at Memorial General, find the truth about what was done to Audrey 6 months ago. And Finn was the best hacker money could buy. He found it. On the morning of the 7th day, when Rhett was able to sit up and move around again, Finn walked in with a laptop and a triumphant smile. "I've got what you need," Finn said, setting the laptop on the table and flipping it open. On the screen was a chain of files and emails, and most important, security footage from Memorial General on the night Henderson died. The video showed, clearly, Audrey signing the patient monitoring forms on time, by the book. And 3 hours later, another woman slipped into the records room and deleted her signature, Vanessa Hall. Finn had also found an email Vanessa sent to a coworker afterward, bragging about eliminating competition and clearing the path to the head nurse position. She hadn't only erased Audrey's signature. She'd spread rumors. She'd testified against Audrey during the investigation, all of it because she was jealous, and because she wanted the promotion Audrey had been in line for. Audrey stared at the evidence, and it felt as if someone had pulled all the air out of her lungs. 6 months. 6 months branded a murderer. 6 months humiliated, bullied, thrown away like trash. And it had all been because of the envy of someone she'd once called a friend. Rhett looked at her and understood. He didn't say much. He only gave Finn an order: send all of it to the police, and send a copy to St. Mercy. Let them see who they fired. 2 days later, Audrey stood at the entrance of St. Mercy Hospital for the first time since they'd thrown her out. But this time, she wasn't coming as someone rejected. She came as a witness, as a victim being cleared, as a woman finally seen by the truth. The lobby was crowded as always, but the air was completely different. The news had spread. Dr. Richard Mercer had been suspended for falsifying medical reports and stealing credit from colleagues. Vanessa Hall had been arrested for medical record fraud and defamation. And the nurse they'd called a murderer had turned out to be the victim of a vicious scheme. Audrey walked through the glass doors, and people stopped to watch her. There was no mocking laughter now, no poisonous whispering, only an awkward silence, and the averted eyes of people who'd once joined the crowd to bully her. Brandon Price stood in the corner of the lobby, his face paper white when he saw Audrey. He dropped his head, avoiding her gaze, and Audrey could see his hands shaking. She didn't say a word to him. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough to make him live with his shame for the rest of his life. Director George Whitmore waited for her in the center of the lobby, his face drawn with discomfort and worry. When Audrey approached, he stepped forward and began to speak words that were clearly rehearsed. "Miss Cole," Whitmore said, his voice trembling a little. "On behalf of the hospital, I want to offer you our sincerest apology. We were wrong. We didn't investigate thoroughly before making our decision. If you'd like to return, we'd be prepared to welcome you back with a higher position and a salary." "No." Audrey cut him off, her voice calm and without hesitation. Whitmore blinked, startled. "Miss Cole, I understand you're angry, but please consider, we can." "I said no," Audrey repeated. She looked straight into Whitmore's eyes, and he had to take a step back from that stare. I don't need your apology. I don't need your job. I already have my place, with people who actually see my worth. She turned and walked away, without looking back, without a single thread of regret. When she reached the doors, someone was waiting. Maggie Chen. The seasoned nurse stood there with wet eyes and a warm smile. When Audrey came close, Maggie opened her arms and hugged her, holding her tight, as if she were holding a daughter she'd never had. I always knew you were innocent, Maggie whispered. I always knew. Audrey hugged her back, and for the first time in months, the tears that fell weren't from pain or humiliation, but from gratitude. Thank you, Audrey said, her voice thick. Thank you for being the only one. When Audrey stepped out into the sunlight, a sleek black SUV was waiting. Cole Brennan stood beside it, moving a little slow because his wound still wasn't fully healed, but the smile on his face was wide and real. Let's go home, nurse, Cole said, opening the door for her. Audrey smiled and climbed in. Home. A month had passed since the night of horror at the meatpacking plant, and Rhett Blackwood's penthouse had become an entirely different place. The air was no longer cold and distant, no longer filled with the heavy silence of a lonely fortress. Laughter echoed through the wide rooms. Fresh flowers sat on the tables, and a woman with brown hair and green eyes had turned it into something that came close to feeling like home. That afternoon, Penny came to visit. Audrey's sister looked nothing like the pale girl Audrey still remembered from a hospital bed. Penny was so much stronger now, her cheeks flushed with color, her eyes bright, her smile never leaving her face. She was doing a medical internship at a small hospital in the suburbs of Chicago, chasing the dream of becoming a nurse like her sister. Her medical bills had been paid in full. Her lupus was being controlled with the most expensive medications available, and for the first time in years, Penny's future looked brighter than it ever had. The two sisters sat on the penthouse balcony, watching the Chicago skyline turn gold at sunset, and Penny kept asking about everything. About life here, about the work, about the people around Audrey, and most of all, about Rhett Blackwood. Do you love him? Penny asked suddenly, her eyes shining with that familiar mischief. Audrey nearly choked on her coffee. Heat rushed to her face, and she knew she was blushing like a 16-year-old being asked about romance for the first time. Shut up, Audrey said, trying to sound calm and failing miserably. Penny burst out laughing, her clear laugh ringing out into the open air. You're blushing. You really like him. Penny Cole, if you don't stop right now, I'm going to. Going to what? Tell Rhett you like him. Audrey threw a pillow at her sister's face, and they both laughed like they'd forgotten how to laugh. Late that night, after Penny had gone home and the penthouse had settled into its familiar quiet, Audrey went to Rhett's room to check his injury the way she always did. The bullet wound in his shoulder had almost completely healed, leaving only a fresh scar to add to the collection on his body. Audrey sat on the edge of the bed, gently unwrapped the old bandage, and examined the wound under the soft glow of the bedside lamp. She was focused on her work when Rhett suddenly caught her hand. She looked up and met his gray eyes watching her closely in the dark. You can leave any time you want, Rhett said, his voice low and gentle. Caruso is dead. You've been cleared. Your sister is well. You don't need to be here anymore. Audrey looked at him and felt her heart begin to race. I know, she said. But you're still here, Rhett said, and there was something in his voice, an unease she'd never heard in him before. Because I want to be, Audrey answered, simple and honest. Silence. Then Rhett pulled her closer. He didn't ask permission. He only tilted his head and pressed his mouth to hers, gentle at first, as if he was afraid she'd disappear if he used too much force. Then deeper, hotter, when she answered him and slid her arms around his neck. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Rhett rested his forehead against hers, his eyes still closed, and he whispered, I don't deserve you. You know who I am. You know what I've done. Let me decide that, Audrey said, lifting a hand to his cheek. I've seen you do terrible things, but I've also seen you spare a traitor because I was watching. I've seen you risk everything for your sister. I've seen the way you look at me like I matter. She smiled. I'll decide what you deserve. Rhett pulled her down beside him, and Audrey laid her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath warm skin. She looked down at her own hands, resting over his heartbeat, and she realized something. Her hands weren't trembling. For the first time in years, since leaving Afghanistan, her hands were completely still. 1 year later, St. Mercy Hospital was no longer the place where Audrey Cole was called a murderer. It became a place that carried her name. The dedication ceremony for the Cole Medical Wing took place on a beautiful spring morning, with hundreds of people in attendance and long red ribbons stretched across the gleaming glass doors of the new building. Audrey stepped up to the microphone and looked out over the crowd, over familiar and unfamiliar faces, over the walls of the hospital that had once thrown her out like trash. She took a deep breath and began to speak. A year ago, I stood in the hallway of this hospital like someone cast out. They called me a murderer. They called me a killer in white. They believed I didn't deserve to stand here, didn't deserve to be called a nurse. She paused, glanced at Rhett, then looked back at the crowd. But I learned something. Our worth isn't defined by other people, not by what they say about us, not by the contempt in the looks they throw our way. Our worth is defined by what we do when no one believes in us, by how we stand up when the whole world wants us on our knees, by the resilience we carry when everything feels hopeless. She smiled, the smile of someone who had walked through darkness and found light. This wing is named Cole, not to honor me. It's named to remind every person here, never underestimate anyone. The quiet woman in the corner might be the one who saves your life. The man society casts out might be the one who shields you from the storm. Look at actions, not rumors. Look at the heart, not the surface. Applause thundered through the air, and Audrey cut the red ribbon as cheers rose around her. After the ceremony, when the crowd had dispersed and the sun began to set, Rhett and Audrey sat in the familiar black SUV. He took her hand, looked down at their fingers intertwined, and he realized something. "Your hands aren't shaking," Rhett said, his voice filled with surprise and tenderness. Audrey looked down at her hands, then lifted her head and smiled. "Maybe I've healed." Rhett raised her hand to his mouth and kissed it softly. "We're both healing." The car rolled through the streets of Chicago, and Audrey stared out the window at the city that had once crushed her and then lifted her back up. Her voice rose in her own mind like a final message. "They called me a murderer. They were wrong. I'm a nurse. I'm a warrior. I'm a survivor. And now, I'm loved. Never underestimate the quiet woman, because she might be the only one keeping you alive." This story teaches us that resilience and compassion will always win, that scars don't define us, but how we rise above them does. That sometimes the person who believes in us most comes from the last place we'd ever expect. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share so more people can hear meaningful stories like this every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of anything in your real life? Share in the comments below. We'd truly love to hear what's on your heart. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.